Inside of the MVC runtime, there is a component known as the display mode provider, and this provider maintains a list of iDisplay mode objects, and during a request, the runtime will ask each display mode object if it wants to handle the current request, and if so, that particular display mode object is given the opportunity to change all the file paths that are needed to satisfy the request. This is how the behavior we saw in the last clip is implemented. When a request arrived for our application, the runtime asked the mobile display mode object if it should be involved in the request, and when the browser was Opera Mobi, then the mobile display mode said, yes, this is a mobile browser, I want to go in and change things around. Then for each view that we used during the request, that mobile display mode object had the opportunity to render a view with a .mobile in the name instead of the default view. And that happened for the layout view, where we did have a mobile override, and also for the content view and any partial views that we used in the request, even though we didn't have mobile versions of those views. You can add your own display mode into the display mode provider, but keep in mind they are evaluated in order, so the first one that says it can handle a particular request gets the opportunity to do that. So you need to put custom display modes into the provider in the way that will work for your application. The block of code on the screen is very similar to what the MVC runtime would do. Sometime before applications start up, it will add a new display mode to the display mode provider, which you can get to through the static instance property. In this case, the display mode is an instance of default display mode. It makes it very easy to work with all this. And that string parameter that you see in the constructor is a suffix that the display mode will use when it is looking for a view. So literally, does a version of the view exist at the right location with .mobile in the name? The other part of the default display mode to configure is the context condition. This is a predicate the runtime will check to see if the display mode wants to handle the current request. And what you see is a Lambda expression that will return true if ASP.NET determine from the browser capabilities that the current browser is running on a mobile device. And again, that's all configured in the browser files, and the runtime looks at the user agent header sent in the request. But you can implement any type of logic inside of here and look anywhere in the request and return true or false if you want your display mode to jump in. Let's take a look and see how this works. The first thing I want to show you in Visual Studio is that I've added a new action to the home controller. The action is named Display Modes, and it's just going to walk up to the display mode provider, grab all of the existing display modes that are registered there, and hand those off as a view to render. Inside of the view, our model will be an IEnumerable of iDisplay mode. What we'll do is loop through each mode in the model, and for each mode we'll output its display ID, which is essentially a string identifier, and also the result of invoking the canHandleContext method. That is the method that the runtime calls when it wants to find out if a particular display mode wants to get involved in the request and start changing around file names or not. So we'll see a true or false result from that. And if we run it in Internet Explorer, we can see that there are two display modes registered by default in an MVC application. There's the mobile display mode, which returns false when the runtime asks it if it wants to handle this request. And that's the expected result because this is Internet Explorer, a desktop browser. And then there's a second display mode, which doesn't have a name. It's the default display mode, and it's essentially a no-op. It returns true every time, and you'll just end up with the regular default view when that display mode gets involved. So if you register your own custom display modes, you'd always want to make sure that they always come before this default display mode, or you remove that default display mode, because otherwise it will always return true and render the default view, and your custom display mode wouldn't be able to get involved. If we hit that same URL with Opera Mobile, you can see that the mobile display mode returns true. It gets to handle that request. And again, that's the expected result because this is a mobile browser. And now that we can see what display modes are registered and how they're behaving, let's add our own custom display modes. And that needs to happen during the application start event. So of course, we're inside of global.asax.cs where the application start event exists. And we'll call into add display modes to put our own custom display modes here. The first display mode provider that I'll register is another instance of default display mode that will use a suffix of mobile. And I'm doing this to demonstrate what you could do if there's a particular browser that you want it to use a mobile view, but ASP.NET doesn't think it's on a mobile device. So let's say that the browser on the iPad falls into that category. Well, this little bit of code will make sure that when a user requests something from your site using the browser on an iPad, this context condition will return true if the request header for user agent contains the word iPad, and if so, it will look for the suffix mobile in the views, and you can use mobile views whenever someone visits with an iPad. But let me add another default display mode to the provider to show you that we could also have Silk views. So if someone is browsing from a Kindle Fire and we see that the user agent contains Silk, then we could register a Silk view instead of the regular view. And to show you how this works, let's do this. First, let's do a build and come into Internet Explorer and just refresh this page to make sure everything is registered properly. So there we can see it's not Silk, it's not this other mobile display mode that's registered for iPad, and it's not a mobile view, so we're just going to use the default view. Perfect. And so if you want to test some of these other views from a non-mobile browser or a non-Silk browser, well, most modern web browsers today will let you manipulate the user agent string that is sent to the server. That's typically somewhere in the developer tools or in the options. So I just pressed F12 to bring up the developer tools for Internet Explorer, and I want to change its user agent string to something that has Silk in the name. That's not one of the built-in user agent strings here, so let me go to Custom, and I'll give this a friendly name of Silk and paste in the actual user agent string that is being used by Kindle Fires. And let me click Add for that and also set it to use that user agent string. And now let's refresh, and we can see that Silk returns true. And that means that here where I have display modes, if I copy and paste this view, I should be able to create a display modes.silk and have that render instead of the default view whenever the user agent has Silk in it. So let's open up that view and add something just to know that we're getting the right view. So perhaps up here in the body, add some text so we know we're rendering the proper view. Come back to Internet Explorer and refresh. And you can see we're getting the Silk view because that particular display mode returned true. And now if I go back into the developer tools and change the user agent string to just be the default, and we'll refresh this again, we're not getting the Silk view anymore. So this is what you can do with display modes. You can target your output to specific browsers if need be. And the context condition that you write receives essentially an HTTP context object, so you can look around at anything inside of the HTTP context, including things like server variables and cookies in the requests and so forth, to determine if you want to change what view is going to be rendered for the user. And I'll also point out that default display mode takes care of changing all the file names behind the scenes. So when we give it a suffix of Silk and the context condition returns true, it's going to automatically go out and find something like displaymodes.silk and render that, or layout.silk.cshtml. But you can also drop down to the interface definition behind this object, which is iDisplayMode, and take even more control over how the actual file names are produced for the runtime to use.